Everybody, all right, we're back. Last but not least, with Sage Geosystems. So we're on our of the startup. Sage has been in the field over the last year in South Texas, a sedimentary demonstration. So one note, we've got a lot of questions coming in. So in these sessions, so if you have a question that you really want to have addressed, go ahead and put that in early on in the session, because I go through the list and first submitted, so it'll increase the likelihood that you'll get it addressed. All right, without further ado, introducing Cindy Taff, and we'll be back with the Q&A after her presentation. Take it away, Cindy.
All right, thank you, Jamie. Hi, everyone. We're excited at the opportunity to share our field test results today. So the test was designed to prove our unique and patented downward-oriented fracture technology for hot, dry rock and our single well EGS design. So we built our test on 5 decades of great work by the DOE at both Forge and Fenton Hill, and on critical foundational work by SMU and the UT Bureau of Economic Geology. But there's one field study that is not often mentioned that we have also heavily studied, and that's the Genesis Hanover program that was performed by the German government between the years of 2003 and 2012. So the HeatRoot test was performed in an abandoned exploration gas well in Starr County, Texas. We wrapped up the test just a couple of months ago at the end of April after nearly 4 months of operations. And I do want to mention we had no safety incidents. So we plan on sharing the results of our test today. So our HeatRoot technology targets the use of fractures to create basically an artificial reservoir or a tank in hot, dry rock, where we then circulate fluid from the surface to harvest the Earth's heat. So I think we all know that if we can crack the nut on hot, dry rock, we would enable geothermal anywhere, because it's somewhat agnostic to the geology in that you're looking for heat, which is always there at some depth, but we don't need hot water or steam at high production rates. So Sage is focused on making geothermal commercial in bottom hole temperatures between 150 and 250 degrees C, because we want to use existing oil and gas equipment and technologies, and we also want to scale geothermal now. So our EGS design for hot, dry rock also utilizes just one well, and that's in order to reduce the well cost and the overall plant cost. And also, we think it will mitigate induced seismicity by limiting the lateral extent of the fractures. As I mentioned, we re-entered an abandoned gas well in Starr County, Texas, that was drilled in 2008. It was considered a dry hole, so the last string of casing was not run, which left us 9 5/8 inch casing in the hole, which was ideal for our test. Geothermal, as you know, needs large casing sizes. So we are working between depths of 7,920 feet and 11,140 feet. And the maximum bottom hole temperature at the 11,140 feet was 150 C. So our intent was to create a 350-foot vertical fracture, but we were actually able to connect nearly 10 times that. So we were able to connect 3,200 feet in that vertical fracture, which is almost a kilometer. And we see this as a huge win for geothermal. So after connecting this fracture, we then performed a series of circulation and pump-in tests across both the 3,200-foot vertical fracture that we had created, but we also shortened that fracture and did some tests across a 600-foot section of the fracture. Basically, we set a bridge plug and perforated at 8,550 feet. So as you can imagine, over 4 months, we accumulated many hours of testing. We haven't analyzed or modeled all of it. So today, what we want to share is basically the major highlights and takeaways from the testing. So prior to the testing, we spent a lot of money and time installing instrumentation, both downhole and on the surface. So we ran memory and real-time gauges downhole, as seen on the left. And these were meant to measure temperature and pressure. And then we did a lot of instrumentation around the rig, including measuring temperature, pressure, flow rates, and actual volumes of the fluid that we were pumping. So as I mentioned earlier, we collected many hours of data. We've spent time both cleaning it up and analyzing it, but we're still not done. So you can see an aggregate of the data in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. All right, so after connecting the fracture, we then performed both circulation and pump and flowback tests across the 3,200-foot vertical fracture, and then again, as I mentioned, across a shorter 600-foot fracture. So for the circulation test shown on the left, we circulated through the fracture two ways: one down the annulus into the top of the fracture, and then reversing and going down the drill pipe and then entering the fracture at the bottom. So we were able to demonstrate that we could circulate across the entire fracture, but what we couldn't achieve was steady state flow. So in other words, whatever we pumped in, whatever flow rate we were pumping in, we were wanting to get that same flow rate out. So if we pumped in 7 barrels a minute, we were getting 5 barrels a minute out, as an example. And our conclusion is, because this vertical fracture extended actually across two sands, the Yawa and the Vicksburg transition sand, we think we weren't able to achieve steady state because there's a big difference in the frac gradient between the top of the fracture and the bottom of the fracture. So then we performed a series of pump-in tests as shown on the right, and that was to both fill the fracture completely with fluid, but also to try to work around the frac gradient differences between the top and the bottom of the fracture. So we basically pumped fluid into the fracture, tried to fill it up, shut in for different periods of time from 5 minutes to 5 hours, and then we flowed the fluid back. We call this heat cycle, but we've have a lot of people that have termed it aqualung. And I think aqualung actually provides a great visual description for what we're doing. Basically pumping fluid in, expanding that lung, holding your breath, and then letting that fluid come back out. So these tests produced very successful results, and they really point, in our opinion, to a huge opportunity in the geothermal space. So as mentioned previously, when we were circulating across the vertical frac and we couldn't achieve steady state, in other words, the flow in equaling the flow out, the graph on the left shows what our thought is. So basically, there's a large difference in the frac gradient between the top of the frac at 7,920 feet and the bottom of the frac at 11,140 feet, as illustrated by the blue triangle. If we would put enough pressure in that frac to open the bottom, we would actually extend the top of the frac. So we're confident, though, if you look at that red triangle, as you get deeper into the rock and you access hotter rock, which is our intent, we think we might be able to get closer to steady state flow or actually achieve it, because the frac gradient actually starts to move closer together, as seen in that red triangle at the bottom. So basically, when we reduce the frac to reduce the frac gradient delta, I talked about having a 600-foot frac length. So we plugged back, created a 600-foot frac length that reduced the delta between the frac gradients at the top and the bottom, and then we did some circulating through there as well. All right, so in the circulation test, this data actually shows the results from circulating down the annulus, entering the frac from the top, and circulating across that shortened 600-foot frac that I mentioned. So the frac between 7,920 and 8,550 feet. So some general observations from this test were that, first of all, we were able to circulate across the entire 600-foot frac, but we still were experiencing some short circuiting or the inability to get returns to equal the rate pumped into the fracture. However, we were actually able to get better returns across the 600-foot frac than we did across the 3,200 foot frac. So shortening it did help. Circulating down the annulus, entering the frac from the top gave us about 70 to 90% returns, while if you were circulating down the drill pipe, entering the frac from the bottom, you were getting less than about 30% returns. And we think that's because not only were you had friction working against you, but you had gravity working against you while you were trying to pump up the fracture. One of the other things we recognize is that we were not filling the fracture during the circulation test. So we also think that helped to contribute to the short circuiting. And then another observation is that we could readily open and close the fracture network, and the fracs really open and close at very predictable pressure. So our reflection was, after 30, 35, 36 years in the oil and gas industry, we never really did work fractures like this in the oil and gas industry because we didn't have to. We would frack a well, put proppant in it, and leave it alone. But anyway, we were able to see what the fractures, how they would work when you open and close them, and that the opening pressures were quite predictable. One other thing is, because we were working with vertical fractures, we were taking more measurements in the vertical plane. There are a lot of oil and gas experiments being done, but most of the measurements are being taken in the horizontal plane. So our final observation was that the injection and production points actually start to behave a bit independently, which, as we know, is not, it's counterproductive for EGS. So that was an overview of our circulation tests. So our next series of tests, as I mentioned, were these pump-in flowback tests, which we call heat cycle. So before we started the heat cycle test, we first pumped a 500 barrel of pad of fluid into the frac to basically load the frac. And then we cycled, as you can see on the graph, several 50 and 100 barrel volumes into that fracture by pumping in and flowing back. I mentioned we would pump in, shut in for different periods of times, and flow back. So some of our observations here was, for each cycle, we are actually able to flow back all of the fluid that we put into the fracture, which in circulation, we didn't get all the fluid back as we were circulating, but if we ever shut down and allowed that fluid to come back, it would all come back. Regardless of the length of time that we shut down between injection and flow back, we actually did not see a large difference in the temperature of the fluid that we flowed back. And we concluded that the fluid was actually flipping. So as the cold, more dense fluid was pumped in, it would travel down the fracture and then push the hot, less dense fluid up the fracture. And that's what would get pushed out. And that's what we were measuring. And we did some modeling on that, and our modeling has confirmed this flipping phenomena in the fracture. To keep the injection and production points in sync and to be able to consistently flow back all the fluid that we pumped in, we needed to operate within the window that's shown in red, that box, which is basically above fracture opening pressure, but below fracture extension pressure. We feel like if we operate within that window, which is about an 800 PSI window for this particular test, then we can adjust our volumes, we can adjust our rates. There's a lot of flexibility that we can do, but that was the operating window that we wanted and needed to be in. Our last critical observation that I'd like to mention is that when we were doing the pump and flowback test at the 11,140 foot depth, which is a tight mudstone, we saw little or no leak off. So on the plot, you can see the pressure immediately increases about 40 PSI when we shut in. And that's because basically the fluid is being trapped, it's being heated, and it starts to expand. So, our conclusion was this was a very low permeability formation, little or no leak off. And, this type of formation would actually enable us in the future to use refrigerants instead of water in the fracture, because you don't have to worry about a massive leak off and then a massive loss of a very expensive fluid. And if we're able to do that, we can eliminate the need for the heat exchanger and increase the overall efficiency of just generating more electricity with our power plant. All right, so we are still examining and modeling the over 4 months of data from our Starr County field test, but here are the conclusions so far. First, a single well EGS is easily created, and it will result in reduced costs because it's a one well system versus a doublet. We can confidently connect a vertical fracture at the bottom of a well with our HeatRoot downward oriented fracturing technology. A reliable connection across the fracture is greatly improved if we operate above frac opening pressure. Recall the red triangle on the plot or on the slide two back, because it doesn't allow the fracture to close. So that's really where you want to be operating. Short circuiting during attempts to circulate across the fracture can actually be solved by cycling the fracture with the pump in flow back method that we call heat cycle. So you get around short cycling by just doing heat cycle. And then I mentioned just last, targeting low permeability formations allow the use of more expensive refrigerants, and therefore we can get a higher net power generation if we're able to do that. And the last thing I want to mention is we had 4 induced seismicity monitoring stations that we worked with the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology to install. And they helped us to evaluate the data. So in the 4-month period where we were fracking, where we were circulating, we saw no earthquake events or no induced seismicity events. So we thought it was very successful in that regard. And Jamie, that's it. We're ready to go to questions.
Awesome. All right, thanks for that, Cindy. Okay, so same deal for submitting your questions in the blue bar at the bottom of the screen, not in the chat because I cannot see those. So let's get started. Thanks for the presentation, Cindy, and I'm inviting Lance Cook onto the stage. He's Sage's CTO, and both of them have been at Pivot the last few years in a variety of different roles. So, all right. There's a lot of questions. I imagine you all are expecting this one on your fracs. So we've got, I'll group them, a few of them together. Why did you decide to use fractures? What was your fracture width? And let's talk about the vertical fractures. How did you do those? Were they successful? What made you think to do them vertically, etc.? So this is a multi-part question.
Lance, you're on mute.
So fracture width, it's standard fracture width, millimeter, in the millimeter range. The fracture down is born out of the belief that we really need a chimney. We need the heat. We don't need to create an attic above us where the heat collects. We want all heat from below us funneled right up to the perforated interval. And so that's the fundamental concept there. Plus, we can frac downward. We can control this so that we don't frac up. And that really opens up a lot of potential when you start looking at drilling deep. So for example, in South Texas, at around 16,000 feet, you get diagenesis, and the rock gets really low porosity, really low permeability. And if you do a normal frac, you're going to bias yourself up, and you can frac into porosity, etc. What we're able to do is go down into the diagenesis, perforate, and control the fracture down, make sure that we don't open up any permeability that we don't want. And then we can create our own engineered reservoir down hole in this very tight rock, where we know exactly the volume that we're creating and the surface area where we'll be pulling heat from.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Jamie, the only thing I would add is the last part, that there was a question, why are you using fracturing? So to harvest heat in hot, dry rock, you need to maximize the surface area to get that heat exchange. And fracturing, this type of fracture can create a huge surface area very quickly and very cost effectively. And we've demonstrated that we don't have induced seismicity. So that's, and the other reason is that, why a vertical fracture? Because we are trying to create a single well EGS system. So vertical fracture makes more sense than trying to, perforate, frack away from the well in order to connect to another well, because we just want a single well EGS system.
Here's a couple of follow-ons. We can stay on fracks. And so let me just wrap these questions in as we discuss. There's a question, did you use proppant in the fracks? There's another question, when you were engineering the fracture and the well line, why not plan to inject into the bottom of the formation to allow the heated fluid to naturally rise? What do you think about these things?
So the circulation from the bottom does make a lot of sense, but the mechanics just didn't work out. So we tried circulating from the top down and from the bottom up. Circulating from the top down on these vertical fracks is just a lot easier and much more efficient than going from the bottoms up. But yeah, certainly we could figure out to go from the how to get a higher return from the bottoms up. There's some advantages that we'd like to test, but in this set of tests, we weren't able to get there.
And we did not pump proppant, Jamie, which is different from oil and gas. I mean, Lance and I had years and years of that was part of our well design. But because we are working these fractures, we're literally creating them, circulate through them, ballooning them, letting them close. We did not need proppant, and actually it would have been a waste of money. So yeah, we did not have proppant in these wells.
Yeah, we want to use these fractures like a big bellows, right? And so proppant just gets in your way. So we want to allow it to open, and we want to allow it to close. That way we make sure that we get all the fluid from the bottom of the fracture back up to the top of our well. So not only do we rely on the heat segregation, but then we also mechanically move the fluid back and forth by flexing these fractures.
Let's stay on the fracks. There's a lot of questions. One of them is the key operational parameter. So, okay, so how did you grow a downward frac? There's a bunch of questions about this. How did you do it? What was the key to doing it? How did you ensure that you with a symmetrical fracture, a typical fracture network, et cetera? Can you dig into that a little more?
Yeah, so there's a really good paper that came out about 18 months ago from Imperial College, Salemzadeh, Salemzadeh, and Zimmerman, which goes through all the math. But real simply, if you have a fracture gradient of, let's say, 1 psi per foot, you've got to ask the question, how can I load that such that I will create a fracture growing downwards? Now, how do you create a load on something that is steadily getting stronger as you go deeper? The natural thought when you think on just the capacity side is you can't do it. I mean, because it's naturally going to want to fracture the weaker stuff. But what you can do is run a string of pipe to the bottom of the hole and circulate a fluid that has a gradient that is higher than that 1 psi per foot. So what we did was circulate from the bottom a fluid which had a 1.3 psi per foot gradient. And what happens is, as you circulate that fluid up the hole, it reaches a certain point and it just starts fracking downwards. It's drillers call it lost returns, right? You see it on the morning reports all the time. It's you weight up higher than you should, and you lose returns. And if you look at a lost returns event, the fluid's going downward.
The nuclear industry also used downward or gravity fracking for getting rid of or disposing of nuclear waste. So it's definitely not new.
Yeah, we've developed a real simple two-dimensional deal to show, which I think helps not only the CFOs that we talk to, but also the scientists that we talk to. It's a really simple concept, and I'd be happy to anybody who wants to give me a call. I'll step them through it. We can step through it in like 5 minutes, and then you'll get the fundamental concept if you don't have it already.
Let's do one more follow on this topic. Here's the question. In some areas, injection at or above the frac gradient is not allowed. In this instance, how would this impact a power output of your project?
Okay, so the question really is, you're not allowed to go above fracture extension pressure. What we're really doing is going between fracture opening. Well, really what we're working with is within the fracture opening area, right? We are not extending the frac. So you do not want to extend the frac. You want to keep the volume. If you want a really good reference on a brilliant test of this, a large volume test that was done in Germany. It's called Genesis project, Genesis Hanover, and you can read about actually how this is done. And we did it on a small scale just to stay within budget, but we had the Genesis data for backup in terms of will it scale, and it does scale, and they clearly demonstrated that.
All right, so let's transition. There's a trend of questions about supercritical CO2. So they are essentially, when I've read about you all, the articles seem to be about supercritical CO2. How does that come in here? So maybe if you can dig into that more generally, and then that will get a group of the questions, and then we can drill down a little further if anybody has follow-ups.
Yeah, so let me just give you an update on what we're doing with Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio. So we have a detailed design for a 3 megawatt prototype geothermal turbine that uses supercritical CO2 as the working fluid. It is the components of the turbine are actually being machined right now. The test stand is being assembled as we speak. So we'll be doing a load test in San Antonio in September of this year, so a couple of months from now. The other thing that we've been working on is certain types. We're very committed to CO2-based fluids, so we've been working with modeling certain types of refrigerants mixed with CO2, and have found actually some very powerful mixtures which will basically lower your parasitic load, and depending on the ambient temperatures, and that way you raise your net power output. And so we're very excited about the technology. The other thing is these turbines are quite small, so they're going to be less expensive, and the conversion factor, or the efficiency of converting heat to electricity, is estimated to be about double organic Rankine cycle.
Awesome, thank you, Cindy. There's a group about the demo. What's the plan for the demo? Will it become an electricity producer? If not, what are you going to do with it? There's a group of questions about output per well. Can you address some of these together?
Yeah, so we're not planning on doing anything. Well, we will do further testing, but we are not planning on making this into a power. It's too far away from the grid just to start with. Okay. In terms of output per well, the neat thing about this system is that if you're using fractures and you're cycling fractures, they're additive. So think of it as Well, it's just like drilling a well in the Eagle Ford. The longer you go and the more fractures you connect, the more production you get. So we can engineer a well design which will give us certain output based on how many fractures we create in, let's say, to make the visualization easy, let's say we drill a horizontal well and we do 7 fractures in that. What we saw here on this well, we were getting about 5 barrels a minute out of a fracture. Once we charged it, it would flow back at 5 barrels a minute. If you open the upper fracture, you would double that. And so in theory, if you put 7 in there, you'd get 35 barrels a minute. And our calculations is we can, at 180 C, we could get somewhere around 4 to 4.5 megawatts out of that. Now, you run into a restriction with your casing size. If you want to go to 70 barrels a minute, you need to go to 9 5/8 inch casing down to depth because of the friction losses, and then you can go to 14. So it's pretty cool. You can engineer a designed output into these wells by using this technique.
So Jamie, our next step is a demonstration plant, probably in South Texas, drilled to about 19,000 feet. The well would be drilled to 19,000 feet, and with an estimate of 3 to 4 megawatts per well. And the bottom hole temperature at 19 would be about 235 C.
Awesome. All right, y'all, we have about 3 minutes. So let's do a really quick chat about induced seismicity and then a 1-minute close for y'all. There's a group of questions about induced seismicity. The summary essentially is, why didn't you have any? In oil and gas, you do a frac, you have something small sometimes, right? What is your guess on why you didn't have any? And do you think it has anything to do with your vertical? So address that within a minute.
We had surface arrays, just like the Genesis system did. They saw the exact same thing, 0 responses. I think for us to actually see the fractures cracking, we would have needed to install offset geophones in an offset well, which we did not do. But we used the conventional seismicity array for these tests, just as the Genesis did. We were not trying to map micro noise to try to map the fractures.
Yeah, a few reflections, Jamie. When we frac, because we're using a heavy fluid, and it's a gravity frac, it's a low rate frac. So it's not, you don't have 20 rows of pumps out there pumping at 20 or 30 barrels a minute, right? It's a rig pump. We fracked with a rig pump. The other thing is, we're trying to do geothermal in hot, dry rock. So unlike the oil and gas industry, we actually want to avoid naturally occurring fractures and faults, which could be sources of induced seismicity. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that, because it's a single well EGS, the actual lateral reach from the well is shorter than if you're trying to frac between 2 wells. So we think that helps a lot. We would be cognizant if we are working, near a basement rock where you've got a major fault, and if you pump continuously, trying to fill this fault where you can then cause slippage, that would be a concern. But with the volumes that we're pumping and the fact that we can limit and design our volumes, we think we can avoid the induced seismicity challenges.
Yeah, I think
we're
that's
over
really
time. Quickly,
okay.
Hold on one second, Lance. We're over time. But I want to give y'all a 30 seconds each to close on what's next. How fast can you go? What's the plan going forward? There's a good deal of questions on that. Can you take 30 seconds each? Cindy, why don't you start?
Yeah, what's next is we're going to install a demonstration plant, put all of our technologies together, show that we can be commercial in geothermal in the lower temperature ranges. And then from there, we've got customers all over the world interested.
Lance?
I think Cindy nailed it. I mean, we're in the traditional valley of death for new technologies. I think we've proved the components. Now we've got to go prove we can put it together in the field in a demo plant. And basically, you know, what you see is the banks and the federal government, et cetera, do not want to take technology risks. They want to see that demo plant. So we do that demo plant, and then once you get over this valley of death, there seems to be a lot of interest on the other side once we get the demo plants in place. So
All right.
That's our focus.
Geothermal exponential. Thanks, both of y'all. We've got to run, but feel free, audience. I know there were a ton of questions here to ping Cindy or Lance in the audience in the chat. So thank you very much, both of you, for your presentation. And we'll see you all later. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back for the next session.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.